Welcome, everybody, to the 1 p.m. time slot Pacific time for our Peralta Online Equity Conference. We're here with Vistasp Kharbari, who's going to talk about understanding and attaining equity in artificial intelligence in higher education. But before we get there, we are just going to hear a couple little housekeeping notes. First, if you would like to use the captions, they have been turned on. So all you have to do is go down to that toolbar on the Zoom window and select the caption button. Or if you don't see it, it might be hidden under the button that says the word more with 3 dots. A menu will pop up when you click that more menu, and you'll see captions is one of the menu options, and you can turn them on from there. Next, we hope that you will feel comfortable sharing via chat any questions or comments you have about the topics that Vitas brings up during this session. So please use the chat. And then last, we are recording this for people who cannot join us in real time. So hello to all of you watching the recording. But know that if you choose to use a voice comment or something when there's a Q&A, that your name and or likeness might get captured unless you keep your camera off. So that's up to you. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Vistasp to introduce himself more thoroughly and to get us started.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. As you all heard, my name is Vistasp Kharbari. I'm a professor in civil engineering and a professor in mechanical and aerospace engineering at the University in Texas at Arlington. I served as the president over here for 7 years before coming back to the faculty. So I speak from a mixed perspective, if you will, both as an administrator and as a faculty member. I'm also someone who's used AI for years and years, more in my research than anything else. During today's discussion, I'll stay away from research. I'm going to be focusing primarily in the education space and on our students. Feel free to sort of put something in the chat. I'll try to keep my eyes on it as well as I go forward. And if I can, I might try to answer questions as I go along. Otherwise, my apologies. I'll get to them at the end. What I'm going to try to do this afternoon, especially because it is afternoon, is try to give you a little bit of a background, but also give you some thoughts so that hopefully you don't fall asleep just following my voice. So if we look at AI, and if we look at the evolving campus, I'd like to take you back a little bit. Our campuses have been primarily defined on the basis of space. And we changed from space to having computer labs, IT in the computers. During COVID, we moved to Zoom teaching. We moved to transactions being online. Space had historically constrained access and maintained levels in society by artificially constraining who could come to a campus and who could not. When we went online in a variety of ways, not just in terms of online education, but having networks to join us across the globe, we enlarged the space, we increased engagement, and potentially we enhanced equity. The progression from physical and digital to phygital campuses increases the potential for access. It also caused a change in the evolution of the dissemination of knowledge. We moved from the sage who was surrounded by students to much larger classrooms. Classrooms that might have anything from 30 to maybe even 300 to 400 students. In the early 90s or late 90s, we changed to a mode where multimedia became more prevalent in our classrooms. And then, of course, we saw the start of MOOCs and online education, the Zoom classroom, if you will, that started during the COVID pandemic. And hopefully we shifted from bringing students to campus to enabling learners to access knowledge wherever they are. The move to online education enhanced the potential for access, but as we found during the COVID pandemic, and we still have this today, our expectations in terms of coverage and our expectations of who could have access to our knowledge was far from reality. We had a lot of our students who were basically sitting in Starbucks or other areas, sitting in the parking lots, trying to be able to hook onto the internet, onto the web. We also found that the coverage speeds, the upload and download speeds were not good enough for what we needed just for online education. We also found that it was spotty in certain areas, or that our students did not have access to computers and laptops. Maybe the only thing they had were cell phones and mobile devices, and our educational content was not provided on that sort of a format. Fast forward to today, and we still have some concerning stats. And we've gone from talking about online education to talking about AI in education. But here are the stats that are still concerning. 24 million people in the United States do not have high-speed internet. And this is an FCC number from this year. 23% of Americans do not have access to broadband connectivity at home. 40% of schools lack broadband access. 33% of these do not have speed sufficient for even video conferencing. 40% of Black and 28% of white households do not have high-speed fixed broadband. This came from a 2020 census from McKinsey. And the median bandwidth today is 1.2 Mbps. The 2015 standards were 25 Mbps for download and 3 Mbps for upload, whereas the recommendations that came out earlier this year were 100 Mbps and 20 Mbps. So a significantly large sort of discrepancy between where we should be and where we are. Before we begin talking about AI, let's talk about literacy for a second. We've generally considered literacy to be the ability to read and write. However, when we started looking at large amounts of data, we started talking about the ability to read, understand, and manipulate, and an important word, use data in the context. And I'll come back to this when we talk about equity in AI. We talked about digital literacy, and I won't go into depth of it, but it was not just using data, but it was having the tools and the facilities to actually construct new knowledge, create media expressions, communicate with others, and more importantly, as identified by UNESCO in 2018, it included competencies that were necessary. So it's not just the black box that we use in order to use it, but we understand what we're using and how we can make use of what we have. We now come to the buzzword of at least the last 2 years, when we started talking about AI literacy and AI. And for AI literacy, we really need to have skills and competencies to use AI technologies and their applications effectively. And especially with AI, as I'll go through, it's about viewing these technologies critically, understanding the context in which they can be used, and questioning their design and implementation. The question of what makes a person AI literate is also evolving, because these platforms and these technological tools are evolving, although very, very quickly. We know that we have the digital divide. It's a gap between those who have access to technology, the internet, and digital literacy training, and those who does not. It affects all generations, all communities, whether it's urban or rural, whether the developed countries, developing countries, or underdeveloped countries. Add to the digital divide now the AI divide, because the same basic foundations that we use for the digital work is used on the AI side. If we do not have upload and download speeds that we cannot use for normal internet and normal online, we obviously will not be able to do the same thing with AI. If we do not understand the platforms and how they are being used and how they work and how the data is being used on them, then the problem becomes even worse in terms of AI. If a person doesn't have agency about their own data in terms of the digital world, think about where that goes in terms of AI itself. So when we look at it now, let's look at the potential of AI before we start talking about what are the challenges with it. There's some huge potentials with AI, and I'm going to focus just in terms of the potential that exists for learning. And if you look at it, we've all talked about personalized learning in tutors, such that you could actually personalize the content to an individual. We move away from the one size fits all, where every student is expected to have the same background, do the same things at the same time. even though we know that every student is different. Progression can be based on an individual space, desired learning path and experiences, and obviously what we have in terms of Bloom's 2 sigma rule, which basically says that if you have an individual tutor, you are going to do significantly better. In fact, 2 sigma away from those who don't have it. This becomes a reality with AI. You can also have specialized assistants for our students. From the very simple checking of grammar and enhancing language and translating, to assistance in self-assessments, organizing thoughts, suggesting outlines and developing drafts, to updating of documents and curating and synthesizing information. We could go into immersive learning, where we can actually put a student into a situation that otherwise they would not have been able to do. Think, for example, of the training of nurses, where we have so many nurses being actually trained through online education. These nurses can be put into a 3D simulation where they can actually feel as though they are in an operation theater, and they can feel the stress of a patient dying. The same thing can happen for engineers, where they look at a large, it's a destructive event, and be able to make decisions real time, things that we cannot allow our students to do in the classroom, because of course there are resources and there are risks and dangers that are tremendous. We all talk about AI and everything else, and we say it'll decrease our critical thinking skills. But actually, if you look at it, it increases our contextual critical thinking skills, or at least it can, if used properly, because we can put students into that context. We can use the simulations to give them insight and context, including history. Put someone into the Battle of Waterloo so that they can see what's going on. Put someone into the March on Selma and see what was going on at that time through their own eyes, rather than taking just the written word. We can enable learning by living or experiencing circumstances, and through living by actually doing, or learning by doing. And we can enable the integration of sociocultural aspects into the analysis of situations and case studies. It can also enhance engagement in learning. Think about the power. If a student could actually have a debating session with a personality that was historical and be able to talk to them in their context and use that as a debating partner so as to strengthen their ability to learn something. We all know that we learn much better when we have actually been able to explain it to someone else. Think about the power that brings with AI, where we can develop and refine our arguments and our cases by doing that and getting timely encouragement and guidance through that. Think about the fact that a lot of our students, most of our students, are not able to have advisors and counselors when they need them 24/7, and AI could make that possible. We can give them encouragement and scaffolding and direction for co-curricular activities. We can put early warning systems in place. All of this is possible today and is being done. Think about AI-enabled curricula as well, where we can provide online and digital offerings at scale, as long as we're authentic about the fact that the instructor may not actually speak 6 different languages, but the content can be provided in real time in 6 different languages. We can update our curriculum so as to make it individualized for each student. We can have modularity so that every student is then serviced based on what they need, rather than the one size fits all that we've used. And there are tremendous amounts of advantages that can be there for faculty as well. Let's take that, and for a second, I'm going to ask you all to think about what it would be if all of this were possible for all students. Not just students at the best resourced universities and the best resourced colleges, but for all students. Think about what would be possible if this were possible for every student, irrespective of where they lived. It's irrespective of their income, and irrespective of whether they were first generation or their parents had been to college before. I'm going to assume that the answer from most of you, if not all of you, is that would be great. The challenge, however, is that's not where we are. We have a huge AI divide because we have a digital divide, and this takes it to one step higher. When we talked about the digital divide, we first talked about technology and the tools. Then we talked about those who knew how to use the technology and tools. When you come to the AI divide, it's those two, and it's more on top of it. The unfortunate part is that most of our students will not have access to the full breadth of AI, even today or even 5 years from today, unless we actually look at it and start resolving it. It magnifies the impact of the digital divide. Access to information and knowledge that a person could get through AI might only rest in the hands of a few. The convenience and the scope of learning, of being able to do it 24/7 whenever you want, and being able to have a tutor, which actually takes away from the advantages that those with resources had, where they could hire tutors for their children, and you could democratize it, can only be possible if AI is done with equity. Learning experiences could also be a positive or a negative, depending on whether some had it or all had it. The use and the experience of technology, it's one thing to be able to have the technology, it's another thing to be able to have the tools with which you can use the technology, understand it, and then adopt it. Success in entering and remaining relevant in a fast-changing workplace is one of the greatest problems that we have today. And therefore, if we do not speed up in terms of making AI possible for everybody at the same level, our challenge is going to be that some are better prepared for the workplace and others are left far behind. And if you look at our potential career sectors at risk, this is just from a recent report that came from Business Insider, and we might argue about whether one or more of these are correct or not, but these were the top 10 that were identified in March. If you look at it, these are the exact areas where we have a significant percentage of our degrees. So very frankly, sitting as a person in higher ed, my concern is, are we doing enough to make sure that our students are not going to become obsolete, not because AI is going to take their jobs, but because we haven't moved fast enough to make sure that they are qualified for an AI world, and that all our students have the access to be able to be qualified for that AI world. When we talk about the levels of AI, and this is where I really want to start delving a little bit deeper now into what we should be looking for. Where I look at AI, there are 3 different levels of AI that we can show. Sure, I'll go back one. So there was a question that says, is it possible to re-show the previous slide with a list of jobs? And I'm going to go ahead and do that because I'm assuming I moved too fast and people still want to take a look at it. So let's put that up again. Again, keep in mind that this came directly from the report. We may or may not agree with some of them. We may or may not agree with all of them. But the content is that a lot of the jobs that we are providing for our students, preparing for our students through their bachelor's degrees, are going to be jobs that could be taken by AI, unless, of course, we upgrade their skills to a higher level. And the question is going to be, can we update it equitably for all of them? So if we look at the levels of AI, then here's what we need to start talking about. We can talk about ethical AI. And I think Florida looked at it in 2021. There were 5 core principles around which it was built: beneficence, non-malfeasance, autonomy, justice, and explicability. Then we moved to responsible AI. Not just AI that was ethical, but the responsible use of AI, which focused on the development of AI to build fairness, interpretability, privacy, and security into all these systems. When we start talking about equitable AI now, we have to make sure that we are looking at the growing concerns about bias. I'm sure all of you have heard about cases of bias, either implicit or in the data itself, or unintended, that comes because of the data that has been scraped, or the algorithms that are written by people who might have inherent biases themselves and most often don't even know about it. The bias is not just in terms of the input, but the bias could also be in terms of the output that is there, because of whether these are going to be actually structured in order to be understood. and the lack of representation that comes from historical gaps that exist, not just in the representation of different segments of our population and society, but the lack of representation in data itself and the way that we have gone forward, which means we must ensure that affected stakeholders and communities reap the benefits of technology rather than any harm. And that's going to become the important part. So if we look at it and we talk about overcoming the AI divide, in my opinion, we need to look at it at 4 different levels. And especially from the perspective of our students. Do they have access to technology and tools? Do we have access to training and expertise so that we can teach them about the technology and tools that they're going to have to use and then be able to use in their work? Access to resources to attain AI literacy. It's one thing to have a black box. It's another thing to understand what goes on in the black box and to be able to interpret it and use it in the best way possible. And the question again becomes, do we have the ability to do that today? Will we have the ability to do that in the future? And the last, which in my mind is the most important, the power of this, the potential of this is only going to be there if our students have the ability to use all these tools, the technology, and the expertise to gain socioeconomic mobility. Because at the end of the day, although I do come from academia, it's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's knowledge so that everyone else has a better place in life, so that they can do better than their parents have done. They can take that change that they're making for themselves and help their parents with the change, as well as the communities in which they live, they reside, and they work. So let's look at these 4 levels when we start talking about, let's say, AI and equity. Level 1 is access to technology and tools, and that's the simplest one. Is the technology available? Is it affordable? Technology being available doesn't mean that it is accessible to everyone, because it might be too expensive for most people to use. And then, is it in a form that can be adopted by our students in the context of learning and for preparation for success in the workforce? AI that is used by our research institutions is going to be very different from AI that is used for teaching and learning. And they're going to be very different levels depending on our students themselves. Do we have reliable high-speed broadband connectivity? Something we haven't been able to answer for the digital divide as well. Can we do this now with AI, especially when the upload and download speeds have to be much faster to be able to use the full extent of AI? Devices on which AI programs and platforms can be used actively. Do we have those? Most of us will not be able to use AI just on a cell phone. We're going to need a laptop or a tablet. Can we actually have access to them, at least today? Do we have appropriate AI tools and platforms? It's nice to have a free version of an AI tool, but you don't have the full extent of what can be done and what can be used for teaching and learning. That's what we need to look at. The second level is, if we could guarantee that we had all of this, we then need to go to access to training and expertise. This means that we need to be able to have access to and use of the appropriate expertise for training and adaptation and specialization of these AI tools and platforms to the context and mission of the institution. This is not a simple case of a black box that makes it valid for everyone to use. It has to be specialized. It has to be individualized, personalized, if you will, at least at the level of the institution that is using it, which means that our faculty and staff have to be trained first. We cannot expect that each of them is just going to suddenly automatically switch on that bulb and light and say, I am now AI literate, and therefore I can teach my students not only how to use the black box, but in also to be able to do it as well. Language can be a barrier. Most of our platforms today are only available in English. What does that mean for someone who has English as a second language or learns in a totally different language? What is the sociocultural context in which AI will be used? Because most of the scraping of data that has been done from certain segments only. Other segments may not have any AI written about it as well. Any data that can be taken by AI, does that wipe those out from the use of it? And what about collaboration between institutions of higher education and the edtech developers and vendors so that we get developed for us AI tools that will truly be of use to us rather than a generic AI tool that looks nice, feels nice to play with, but really does very little for the advancement of teaching and learning. Level 3 for AI equity is access to resources to go beyond just using it, but to attain literacy, which means to be able to analyze, develop, and create rather than use a black box. And for every student, if we're truly to say that AI is going to help in their path, in their academic path as well as their career path, they have to be able to use it, not just say, give me an answer and accept whatever comes from it, which means active use of that technology and tool by being able to change it. What are the ethical bounds that are developed by institutions of higher education for the use of this data? Each time we actually interact with an AI tool, we are providing data to it, unless we're very, very careful. What are the ethical ramifications of data governance when we have a large number of our students, and for that matter, ourselves, use AI but may not know how that data is being used? What is the level of agency or control at the institutional level with a focus on ethics and compliance? How do we assure our students that data gathered from them for one purpose is not used against them in another purpose? For example, if a student says, I'm only interested in X, well, you could have a very active administration say, great, we're only going to provide the choices in a path, which is now done by AI, and advise to them along that single path, rather than allowing them to move to other areas as well. Great potential, because it could open the world out to students. But if not used the right way, it could constrain it even further. We could depersonalize education to the level where it becomes automated with choices being made by either a machine or humans so that it is more convenient for an institution, for an organization, rather than for our students. And what about platform integration when we have it's ERPs or SIS systems or LMSs, and now the vendors include AI in there? How are we dealing with the data that it captures and what goes on with that data? Level 4 then is if we could guarantee all of these things, then how do we enable equity in socioeconomic mobility? How do we make sure that we have AI to be used as an opportunity for all students and learners, not just for those at the well-resourced private IVs or at the public IVs or at the flagships, but across the board, the regionals, the community colleges, which is where 90% of our students actually go for learning? How do we make sure that they have the tools and they can afford those tools? Because keep in mind, those are most often the ones that are the most poorly resourced in able to get all this. We must address bias, which is implicit, historical, unintended, data-driven that is scraped. We must be able to look at issues that are still being talked about. What happens to copyright and IP? What happens if I take all this knowledge that is there? Think about it as Google and steroids, and it now creates new knowledge from that. Who does it belong to? Do I have a right to say it's part of mine because I put the basis into it? Or is it out free in the web for everyone to take care of? Where do we stand on policies? Can we have thoughtful, open discussion as to how AI is to be used? There is no doubt that AI is here to stay. There is no doubt that there is great potential. But can we have open discussion that says, here are the concerns, and from a student-centered lens, not from the lens of an operation of a institution of higher education or for the operation of a corporation or from somewhere else? How can we make sure that there is a thoughtful, open discussion from a student-centered lens, which has seatbelts, brakes, and airbags, meaning we will do no harm, or if harm is done, we will be able to alleviate it. And more than anything else, we'll be able to tell people that we are using AI in certain ways, rather than them expecting that this is not using AI. So if we look at it then, the key action steps that at least I can think of as we go forward is that we need a lot of partnerships between edtech and vendors and institutions of higher education. Right now, we're at a position where we are given tools and we're using them. We are modifying them as we go forward. We have very little clue as to what the vendors could be able to do. And very frankly, they have very little idea what we really need. And we all know this because every time we go out to buy a new SIS or an ERP or an LMS, we find that in most cases, it doesn't do everything we want it to do. And we find out after the fact that when we go through years of modifying it, some things can be done, some things could not. But if we merge together very, very early in the process, keeping in mind the student and what the student's going to need, that might make a huge difference. Funding mechanisms and formulae. We cannot expect that every institution will be able to afford AI by itself. We can't say stop doing something because AI is now the most important tool that you're going to have, and you have to buy this tool and stop using something else. We know that most of our institutions have already been cut to the bone. Therefore, what we need to be able to do is to figure out if AI is going to provide this potential, how do we build in funding streams through our state boards of education? How do we make sure that this becomes part of what is given rather than something that is given on top? How do we make sure that we have unbiased conveners so that we can have discussions of this? For example, Complete College America is looking at an say AI Equity Council right now by looking at what are the needs of different institutions and how can they be represented. How can we put forward something to vendors that say, this is the minimum standard that is going to be needed for you to be able to work within a setting of the institutions of higher education? Is there going to be agility and openness by accreditors and by regulators? That's going to become a big deal because when we talk about substantive interaction, there are going to be challenges when we start looking at individualized instruction on a single student basis. Even though it might be of great advantage to that student, we might have not looked at all the regulations and the policies that need to be changed. How do we make sure that our boards of governance, the regions, the systems, the state boards of higher education understand the topic with enough information that they can actually make decisions that are based on fact and decisions that are based on the best interests of our students rather than something else? How do we share information across the board, not just in terms of potential and successes, but where things have gone wrong? How do we make sure that an experiment that has been tried in the use of AI that has succeeded wildly is made available to everybody, including the code? How do we make sure that if something did not work as it was intended, everybody learns about it so that we don't go through that learning process over and over again? Is this time for us to have some form of a national or a statewide resource center that brings all these resources to bear for the advantage of our students? We therefore, in my mind, need a comprehensive approach. We need to look at it from a variety of perspectives. We need to make sure that the institution, number one, before we begin, has a clearly stated set of values and ethical standards that are exemplified by leadership. That's important in any case, but AI takes it to one level higher because we're now dealing with information on which we need to have some level of control. We're dealing with information that has historical context and therefore bias. We're dealing with output that has context and bias. We're dealing with information that we actually collect, and students may not be aware that we're collecting it. Students may not be aware, for that matter, faculty may not be aware that certain decisions are being taken now based on a computer algorithm. We need to be able to say that this is happening. That means it must be traceable. It must be explainable. We must be able to align AI initiatives and policies with those values. Therefore, we need to at least come up with a framework. And if you look across the board, there are very few institutions today at any level that has where we need to be in terms of our policies and framework. What do we mean by traceability of data? What do we mean by explainability of data? If a decision comes forth through an AI tool, whether it is for a student being able to do something or not being able to do something, to have access to a certain set of information or not have it, can we actually go backwards and then find out how we actually reach that decision. Right now, and yes, one of the comments that came up was it's curious about how edtech brokers like these shape the landscape. Absolutely. So edtech has shaped the landscape. And my argument is that we need to step forward now as institutions of higher education to bring forth these important concepts that need to be put forth upfront before we do anything else. We need to make sure that leadership across the board has knowledge of AI, its uses and risks at a level to being able to manage it. And we need to be able to establish clear and ethical guidelines and standards for AI use by administrators, by faculty, by students and staff, and especially in the area of accountability and transparency. If we're using a certain set of data, we need to be able to say, this is the data that we're using. And I'm talking about data not in terms of numbers and everything else, but the data that is used for the AI tool itself, because that's what gives the results when the student uses that AI. We need to address equity, including the definition in the context of each institution of higher education, which might be slightly different, and its application upfront. And this can only be done if we engage a multidisciplinary AI team and council, and we actually lead by example. I'm going to leave with a set of final questions that I hope will actually lead to a lot of discussion. Please keep in mind, I'm a believer in AI, but I also believe that if not handled the right way, it could cause significantly more disparity. Will AI be transformative in enabling equity in learning and socioeconomic mobility, with all the potential that it has for individualized learning and for having tutors and for making sure it's not one size fits all and for meeting the needs and the scaffolding of every student? Or will AI, just like a lot of other technology, further widen the digital divide and disparities in attaining socioeconomic prosperity? I think the answer to that rests with each of us, how we move forward as individuals and how we move forward as institutions of higher education together to make sure that this technology is used in the right way and with equity for all our students. With that, I'll stop. I hope I've left about 15 minutes or so for questions.
You have, Vistasp, and I see that Jennifer in the chat has posed a thought prompt that I think ties to this set of questions that you've asked, which is how the ed tech brokers can influence the directions that AI will take and whether or not it performs up to the potential that you've asked in the first question or creates that greater disparity in the second.
I think at this point in time, it could create a greater disparity. And I'm not going to blame the edtech vendors at this point in time. They've gone forward, they've created something, they're trying to sell it to us. If we blindly accept it without trying to raise the issues now to say, this is what needs to be done, then we are at fault. And so we really need to tell them, this is the framework. I don't think we've actually sat down and said, what is the framework under which we will use an AI tool? What are the policies that we will have at an institution? A few institutions have policies, but very frankly, it's still the Wild West in most cases. Some faculty use it, other faculty do not. There are three basic, let's say, groups, if you will, even within. It's an institution of higher education that has said, we will have a framework. Those who will not use AI at all, those who will use AI and blindly follow it, and those who are experimenting with it, keeping students in mind. And I think this is where we have a huge role to play in academia to go out to vendors now and say, this is what we need. This is what we want you to agree to do. Otherwise, we will have tools that have great potential, but unfortunately will not be vectored the right way. Jennifer, I hope I've answered your question.
And Jennifer has shared a number of resources throughout, so we'll make sure to capture all that from the chat. But
And you're absolutely right. It is up to us. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to remember, and I know it's difficult to do, when we talk about ChatGPT or we talk about Gemini or we talk about Llama and we say, Llama did this and ChatGPT did that and ChatGPT answered for me. It's a tool. It's technology. It's not a person. The more we give it the myth and the feeling of a person, the more we are actually giving it agency and the more we're giving up our responsibility to be able to control it. We have to remember it is a tool, and that means garbage in, garbage out. If we do not prompt it the right way, we'll get wrong answers. If we do not have the right data from which it is scraped, it is going to be wrong. We have a window of opportunity right now, and you're absolutely correct, Jennifer. This is our window of opportunity for us to stand up and say, this is what we need, and here's how we're going to use it, not just in terms of vendors, but how are we going to make sure that every student everywhere has access to it? Not just the best resourced to universities, but everybody. Because if this is going to be the discriminator for jobs in the future, as it probably will be, we want to make sure that all our students are prepared for the future workforce rather than just a select few.
One of the questions will then be, how do we coordinate the voices like the ones here in this session so that it's not an incohesive group of people with different goals, different demands, different ways of looking at the world, so that we can have that, as Jennifer mentioned, the agency to assert an equity and justice-centered agenda for AI regulation and guardrails. Because there are some schools that have, as you say, not even begun this process. Not only do they not have a policy, it's not on the agendas for the leadership groups at those institutions. And it's not because they are not interested, it's because they're in hierarchy of needs, struggling to survive, addressing other challenges at their institutions. And so I guess that would be another question to you, Jennifer, or anybody else in the room. How do we coordinate amongst ourselves? This conference brings like-minded people together to think about the interconnection of equity and emerging technologies like AI, but we all go back to our own institutions. What are some steps we can take to at least encourage those who lead our institutions to do so in a concerted way or an informed way?
So there are a couple of groups already working in that area. So WCET and Wiki are already working in the area of AI and trying to put together resources. In fact, on the WCET website, there are about 400 different policies that they have collected from different groups. It's not to say one policy is better than the other, but Van Davis and his group have done a tremendous job at least saying, here's a common database where you can look at what's available out there. To Complete College America right now has an AI Equity Council that is starting to put together thoughts on how it should go forward. And it's always going to be open to ideas from anyone else. So if anyone wants to get in touch with It's Complete College America, I'll be more than happy to get you in touch. Just send me an email and I'll get you in touch with the co-chairs of that group and the AI Council. And there are a number of these other small groups that are putting together the first efforts, if you will, on trying to look at where we should go. But it is going to take a collective effort. It's not going to be just one by itself.
So for those watching the recording, I've added some links related to some of the groups that Vistasp has brought up, WCET and Wiki, and also Complete College America. So we'll make sure we get those links to folks watching the recording as well.
And if anyone has any questions, I may or may not have been sort of able to answer them right now. I also know that just as in class, we think of questions after the faculty member has left the room, and we do the same thing when we're at conferences. Feel free to send me an email. I'll be more than happy to engage with anyone who wants to on this topic. It's an important one, and we need to pay attention to it. So this is where everyone's thoughts, everyone's ideas are absolutely essential.
Well, as we hit the 45-minute mark, I just want to thank you again, Dr. Kharbari, for all of your time and really leading a thought-provoking session here. Like I said, we have a sizable group here, but there are more who will come after to watch the recording. So I hope that people will take you up on your offer to connect and stay connected. I know I'll be finding you on LinkedIn soon. Folks, we will be turning off the recording. You're welcome to stay as we transition into our next session and ask questions via the chat. Please join me in thanking Dr. Kharbari for a wonderful session.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.